All right, if I'm successful, and I think I am, we have Jan Martin's face before you. Ready for the introduction?
Yes.
We confirm. Fine, thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, friends, family from across the country. It is so gratifying to have so many of you that I recognize come share with us again in this fifth year of the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. Our speaker this evening is one for whom I've had to apologize previously because I messed up the communication last fall. It happens to have happened at the time that I had the fall with the creating the three broken vertebrae, but somehow I messed up badly in terms of the communication, and she has been kind enough, forgiving enough to allow me to come back and invite her to get on the screen with us tonight. She is an associate professor in the Department of Ancient Scripture at Brigham Young University. She researches and writes about the Book of Mormon, the New Testament, on 16th century religious reformers, and on the development of the language of English theology, and on early English Bibles. She loves to participate in a wide variety of sporting activities. She enjoys playing the piano when she has time and likes to explore the beautiful Utah mountains. We will expect her to come again on June 30 to present her research on Samuel the Lamanite. We just arranged a schedule change this evening, and so I'm looking forward to a second presentation as well. Because after all, she has come to us highly recommended by Val, and I believe James Lucas also got a positive recommendation in for her. So while she hasn't previously presented here, she has presented many other places, and among other things, has put together a remarkable book on the power of Christ's deliverance, especially appropriate, timely read for Easter. And so let us pray together. Awesome Creator, whose performance reaches light years beyond our ability to perceive. We pause to bow in this Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum to explore, to dissect, to re-examine and appreciate what we believe. Where we join our faith, our mutual appreciation, our sense of venture and a growing love to ask your Spirit to meet with us, to penetrate our being, to open our thinking to enlightenment from above. And this evening, having celebrated the recent Paschal season, we want to be influenced by the improbable story of Jesus the Christ, resurrected for eternal reason. We want to participate with those who have seen his flesh, the nail prints, his loving smile and greeting, to be called by name, included among his friends, to see the transformation from mortality to immortality, a passage so mysterious and so fleeting. So we ask your blessing upon Jan Martin, our presenter, and our participants as we come before you with our dysfunctionalities to help us extrapolate the lessons of Scripture applicable for us to bridge our marginalities. That in the fabric of our lives, the patterns of your eternal design of love can be apprehended in the weave to endure the tests of time, the transfer to the next dimension, embracing the eternity in which we all believe. In the name of Christ Jesus, we pray. Amen. I cut off the screen sharing, and the floor is yours, Jan, for your presentation. Jan has indicated that her preference is for us to defer until she's concluded before interrupting and causing her to miss her place. So, Jan, the floor is yours, and thank you so kindly for giving me and allowing us to get back together finally on this Easter season evening.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate being here. It's always an honor to be in front of people interested in the Book of Mormon and willing to talk and learn. So I'm happy to share some things I've researched and Let me share my screen so that you can see the slides. And then we'll just get started. Okay, everybody see domestic violence in Lehi's family there? Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay, and we'll jump in. In the October 2022 General Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, President Russell M. Nelson unequivocally, let me go back up there just a second. I lost my page here. There we go. He unequivocally declared that any kind of abuse of women, children, or anyone is an abomination to the Lord. 6 months later, in the April General Conference of 2023, Elder Patrick Kieran, who was then a member of the Presidency of the 70, gave an entire talk about abuse and boldly taught that there is no place for any kind of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, or verbal, in any home, any country, or any culture. Their teachings are timely and extremely relevant because the Natural Domestic Violence Hotline of the United States reports that on average, 24 people per minute are victims of interpersonal violence, equaling 12 million people annually. The U.S. Department of Justice affirms that domestic violence affects people of all socioeconomic backgrounds and education levels, and that it not only affects those who are abused, but also has a substantial effect on family members, friends, co-workers, and other witnesses, and the community at large. The World Health Organization reports that globally, hundreds of millions of men, women, and children suffer non-fatal forms of interpersonal violence every year, making it a major public and clinical health problem worldwide. The interpersonal violence described by these organizations includes any behaviors that intimidate, manipulate, humiliate, isolate, frighten, terrorize, coerce, threaten, blame, hurt, injure, or wound another individual. No wonder one writer branded interpersonal violence as a troubling plague that affects too many people around the world. Interpersonal violence becomes domestic violence whenever the violence occurs between family members, household members, or individuals living together. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints live all over the world, and because they believe in and espouse the doctrines of Jesus Christ, which reject all forms of abuse, they may be inclined to believe that abuse is absent from LDS family relationships, but research shows that such is not the case. As far as domestic violence is concerned, Latter-day Saint homes often reflect the norms of the macro societies that they belong to, making abuse a reality for many members of the church. Because the Book of Mormon, another testament of Jesus Christ, has been declared to be the greatest source we have for answers to real-life problems, it is worth investigating if and how it addresses this singularly pervasive and destructive global problem. Significantly, the book confronts the issue almost immediately in its opening chapters. 1st and 2nd Nephi unabashedly showcase multiple instances of interpersonal violence in Lehi's immediate family. Despite his conspicuous presence, scholarship on the Book of Mormon has largely been reluctant to identify the contention in Lehi's family as domestic violence or the perpetrators of that violence as abusers. And this may be why there has been no dedicated scholarly examination of the recorded acts of family violence or any investigation into why interpersonal abuse is such a significant part of the family's dynamics. My purpose this evening, therefore, is to begin to rectify these oversights. I will start by analyzing the family's arguments as recorded in 1st and 2nd Nephi to show that they are more than minor disagreements and that they merit identification as domestic violence because they consistently involve both verbal and physical forms of intimidation, humiliation, isolation, threat, and blame, as well as physical injury. I will then examine Laman and Lemuel's role as the prime instigators of the violence, and I will discuss why modern scholarship may be reluctant to identify the family contention as domestic violence and the two men who perpetrate it as domestic abusers. I will also carefully examine Lehi's parenting style to see where the family's violent behaviors originate, and I will explore Laman and Lemuel's theological beliefs and how those beliefs may have contributed to their violent behavior. Finally, I will conclude that Laman and Lemuel display attitudes and behaviors that match those that modern researchers have shown to be held and utilized by those who are domestically violent today, and that identifying them as perpetrators of domestic violence is appropriate and important, so that the Book of Mormon can serve as a relevant and effective resource for readers who witness, experience, or even perpetrate this troubling global problem. The memorable opening line of 1 Nephi, which reads, "I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents," immediately creates a positive and pleasant impression of Nephi's family of origin. However, that impression's longevity is short, because by the middle of his, middle of his second chapter, Nephi presents a highly charged, contentious interaction between his two older brothers, Laman and Lemuel, and their father, Lehi. Unfortunately, this altercation is not an unusual or an isolated incident. It is followed by 7 additional contentious confrontations that are equally dramatic and which demonstrate that all is not well in Lehi's family. This chart displays each recorded incident. It identifies which family members are involved in each fight, where the disputes happen, the reasons for the upset, and the type of interpersonal violence that is involved. A careful analysis of the 8 recorded instances of contention will show that this family's arguments are much more than the occasional disagreements that are common to all families, and that many elements that characterize domestic violence are present in each. The first recorded heated exchange between family members involves Lehi, Laman, and Lemuel in the Valley of Lemuel shortly after the family leaves Jerusalem. According to Nephi, who may have witnessed the event, Laman and Lemuel confront their father about his religious beliefs and his choice to lead the family into the wilderness near the Red Sea. The two sons passionately argue that their father's visions are merely the foolish imaginations of his heart, that Jerusalem is, in their opinion, indestructible, and that Lehi is leading the family to an inevitable and unnecessary death in the wilderness. The belittling slights on Lehi's intelligence, spiritual capacity, and choices are clear and constitute the intimidating and humiliating verbal abuse in this exchange. But Nephi then adds a chilling description of his brothers that suggests that a threat of physical violence may also have been a factor. He says, "Laman and Lemuel were like unto the Jews who were at Jerusalem, who sought to take away the life of my father." One scholar believes that Nephi slides too quickly from describing the brothers' complaints into accusing them of murderousness, and insists that his description is unwarranted at this early point in the narrative. However, Lehi's commanding response to Laman and Lemuel strongly suggests otherwise. Nephi writes that Lehi spoke to Laman and Lemuel with such power from the Spirit that 2 miracles happen. First, Laman and Lemuel's frames shake before Lehi. This curious description suggests that the 2 oldest sons are briefly unable to control their bodies and become physically powerless. As a result, the second miracle follows, and the sons durst not utter against their father. It seems, therefore, that Lehi, with the help of divine power, incapacitates his 2 oldest sons physically before subduing them verbally. Why would he need to do that unless his sons were about to take away his life? It seems that the profound physical frailty the sons experience not only prevents them from physically attacking Lehi, but leaves such an impression upon them that they also stop verbally assaulting him for a time. This interpretation is substantiated by a later attempt on Nephi's life, where, in an extraordinary outpouring of the power of God similar to Lehi's, Nephi also physically and verbally incapacitates Laman and Lemuel when they attempt to take away his life by throwing him into the depths of the sea. It is possible that Nephi recorded both experiences because they were similar and because they jointly testified that his and his father's lives were genuinely at risk at the hands of Laman and Lemuel. Though Nephi doesn't mention the effect these fraught moments had on other family members, violence always affects those who observe it. Modern research shows that children who witness domestic abuse have the same lifelong mental health effects as if they had experienced abuse directly. One can't help but wonder what Sariah, Sam, Nephi, or any younger sisters might have thought or felt during and after these intimidating, humiliating, and life-threatening altercations. Notably, after the incident in the Valley of Lemuel, the older brothers seemed to cease targeting Lehi for a time and make Nephi, their younger brother, the principal object of their verbal and physical abuse. Although in nearly every future act of violence, other family members are also directly affected. The second contentious altercation in Lehi's family happens during the first of two separate journeys back to Jerusalem. Commanded by Jehovah to return for a set of brass plates, which contain a record of the Jews and also a genealogy of Lehi's forefathers from a man named Laban, the four brothers first try asking for the plates, which fails, and then try bartering for the plates. Laban greedily steals the gold, silver, and other precious items the brothers bring to the negotiation and orders his servants to slay them. After desperately running through the streets of Jerusalem to escape Laban's men, Laman and Lemuel immediately engage in verbal intimidation and humiliation. First, by speaking many hard words to Nephi and Sam, and then by physically beating the two with a rod. Though the Book of Mormon does not elaborate, it seems that Laman and Lemuel blame Nephi and Sam for this second life-threatening failure to get the brass plates, and more importantly, for the loss of their numerous and treasured possessions. Blaming is harmful because it allows one person to place the responsibility for something on another while judgmentally condemning that individual's actions, character, ideas, or worth as faulty. Modern research declares that abusers often externalize responsibility and take their pain, disappointment, or other discomfort out on others verbally, emotionally, and/or physically. The thoughtful reader can't help but wonder what might have happened to Nephi and Sam if an angel hadn't appeared during the beating. One also wonders what bruises and other injuries Nephi and Sam sustained and how those injuries influenced Nephi's decision to make a third solo attempt to retrieve the plates from Laban. The third family fight takes place as four brothers return from the second trip to Jerusalem to invite Ishmael's family to join them in the wilderness. According to Jehovah, Lehi was not supposed to take his family into the wilderness alone and was supposed to provide spouses for his unmarried sons. On the way back with Ishmael's family, which had the requisite number of unmarried daughters, Laman and Lemuel lead a rebellion. The Book of Mormon is silent about the reasons for it, but whatever the case, the rebellion is real and worrisome enough that Nephi tries to prevent it. Unfortunately, his direct and probing questions and his passionate predictions exacerbate the situation. Laman and Lemuel angrily attack Nephi, bind him with cords, throw him to the ground, and intend to leave him in the wilderness to be devoured by wild beasts, all of which is intimidating, humiliating, isolating, threatening, and physically injurious. Though Nephi's version of this event doesn't explicitly say so, it seems that the only way this plan could have worked in a group of at least 15 people, many of whom were adults sympathetic to Nephi, was for Laman and Lemuel to issue intimidating verbal threats against anyone who tried to help their younger brother. It is extremely odd that neither Sam nor Ishmael defend Nephi or try to release him from his bonds, but given the harm that Sam previously experienced at the hands of Laman and Lemuel, as well as Ishmael's age, some scholars estimate he was in his early to mid-50s when he left Jerusalem, they may have had good reasons to keep their distance, even without verbal threats to stay out of it. The abuse only ends when Ishmael's wife and two of her children, a daughter and a son, courageously plead with Laman and Lemuel to stop. The fourth altercation takes place after the family leaves the Valley of Lemuel and journeys through the Arabian Peninsula. As the group travels into the more fertile parts of the wilderness and hunts for food, Nephi breaks his bow. He reports that his brothers are angry with him and that he is afflicted with his brethren because of the loss of his bow. The phrase afflicted with could simply mean that Nephi suffered disappointment, hunger, fatigue, and frustration right alongside his brothers. But it could also mean that Nephi was afflicted with his brethren in the same sense that someone is afflicted with the plague. Perhaps Nephi's brothers were an additional source of affliction to Nephi and not just fellow sufferers. Based on their past behavior, it isn't hard to imagine that their anger against him for breaking his bow manifested itself in intimidating verbal criticisms and in damaging physical assaults. It seems that Laman and Lemuel's bows had previously lost their springs, making it likely that the brothers had already put considerable pressure on Nephi to take care of his bow, since it was the only working bow the family had. When Nephi broke it, the anger they directed at him for doing so may have been as intense as it was outside Jerusalem, when Laman and Lemuel beat Nephi and Sam over the loss of other treasured possessions. Readers often praise Nephi for his diligent efforts to solve the hunger problem created by the loss of his bow. He independently and industriously makes a new wooden bow along with a properly weighted wooden arrow. But his conscientiousness should not distract us from a larger issue. While Nephi is working, why is everyone else in the family doing nothing to help? Nephi says that Laman and Lemuel and the sons of Ishmael spend a lot of energy complaining about their sufferings and afflictions, that his father is doing the same, and that everyone else is exceedingly sorrowful and full of grievances. It is possible that fatigue, hunger, worry, and depression completely incapacitate every other adult in the group, and that Nephi was the only person with enough hope to actively find a solution. But given their past behavior, it is also equally possible that Laman and Lemuel instigated the widespread torpor. The brothers could have afflicted Nephi by verbally blaming and condemning him for breaking the remaining bow, by inflicting bodily harm upon him as the responsible party, by demanding that he rectify the situation by himself because he broke the bow, and by threatening or intimidating other family members so they would not help. It seems that something more serious than mere murmuring or stress-induced slothfulness is going on, since whatever chastisement the Lord wrote upon the Liahona was powerful enough to cause the family to fear and tremble exceedingly. The fifth contentious incident takes place after Lehi's family travels for the space of many days away from the camp of the broken bow and pitches their tents for another space of time, perhaps to take care of an ailing Ishmael, who subsequently dies and is buried in Nahom. The natural grief experienced by the family at his loss, especially by the daughters of Ishmael, combined with the daughters' desires to return to Jerusalem, inflame Laman to the point that he proposes a plan to Lemuel and the sons of Ishmael that they should murder Lehi and Nephi. What this scheme entailed, whether it involved verbal and physical abuse, and how far Laman and his cohorts got in accomplishing it is unclear. But it seems that the threat to their lives was very real, because Jehovah himself intervenes with many chastening words that put a stop to the plot, humble rebellious family members, and restore harmony. One scholar has called Laman and Lemuel rather half-hearted assassins. But if that were true, and there was no real physical danger to Nephi and Lehi, Jehovah wouldn't have needed to get directly involved. As demonstrated in the third contentious incident outside Jerusalem, after retrieving Ishmael's family, there is an economy of divine power. Rather than giving Nephi the strength to burst the bands that Laman and Lemuel bound him with, Jehovah simply loosed them. Elder Neal A. Maxwell once stated, in the economy of heaven, God does not send thunder if a still small voice is enough. But in the economy of heaven, the reverse is also true. God will send thunder if a still small voice isn't enough. Jehovah, speaking to the entire family from heaven, suggests that he needed to protect Lehi and Nephi from a genuine threat. When the family arrives in a fertile place, one they call Bountiful, after 8 years in the wilderness, the family's rejoicing is interrupted by the sixth violent altercation. This one involves another attempt on Nephi's life because he, at the command of the Lord, desires to build a ship, an activity that Laman and Lemuel believe is impossible. The tense moment begins with Laman and Lemuel demeaning Nephi verbally and blaming him for their many years of suffering in the wilderness. The friction slowly escalates. Nephi confidently reminds his brothers that Jehovah is a God of miracles, and as he also calls them to repentance for their murderousness and other iniquities and for hardening their hearts against the divine revelation they have already received. As described above, Laman and Lemuel respond by angrily attempting to throw Nephi into the depths of the sea. The fraught situation is resolved as Nephi confounds Laman and Lemuel both verbally and physically with divine power, impressing them to the point that they nearly begin worshiping him. The miraculous quelling is enough to create sufficient harmony that enables the brothers to successfully build the needed ship. But it is not hard to wonder which family members witnessed the incident and what effect it had upon them. The seventh altercation happens on board the completed ship as the family makes its way to the promised land. A few days into the voyage, Laman and Lemuel, the sons of Ishmael, and their wives make themselves merry with dancing, singing, and speaking with much rudeness. Rudeness can mean coarseness of manner, incivility, rusticity, and vulgarity, but it also has connotations of violence and impetuosity that may explain why Nephi added that this group was lifted up unto exceeding rudeness. After Nephi admonishes them for their inappropriate and possibly physically or emotionally hurtful behaviors, Laman and Lemuel angrily bind Nephi with cords so tightly that he can't move. Nephi says that he's treated with much harshness, which may be his way of saying that he was physically assaulted. In addition, Laman and Lemuel isolate Nephi by threatening every other family member who tries to speak for him, including their usual allies, the sons of Ishmael. They also stonewall their ill and bedridden parents, ignore their distressed and tender younger brothers, Jacob and Joseph, rebuff Nephi's wife and children, and nearly cause the entire ship and everyone on it to be swallowed up in the depths of the sea before relenting and loosing Nephi. Given the extensiveness of the family's suffering that was caused by Laman and Lemuel's behavior, including that of their own wives, it is worth considering the extensive damage that may have been done to specific relationships, to individual self-confidence, or to family members' ability to trust Laman and Lemuel in the future, and how levels of anxiety or fear may have increased for many of them. The eighth recorded altercation takes place after the family arrives in the promised land. Nephi documents that Lehi waxed old and died, and that not many days after his death, Laman and Lemuel and the sons of Ishmael grew tired of Nephi's admonitory words, becoming increasingly angry, refusing to accept Nephi and Lehi's replacement as the head of the family, and planned to slay him. Whether this plan involved a convenient accident, a covert murder, an open attack, or an application of one of the capital punishments associated with the law of Moses is not clear. Whatever the plan entailed, it was divinely foiled by a revelatory warning for Nephi to depart into the wilderness with those family members who believed in the warnings and the revelations of God. Nephi's heartfelt prayers to be delivered out of the hands of his enemies were answered, though perhaps not in the way he originally hoped. Rather than achieving a humble unification of mind and heart with his older brothers, something Lehi also spoke about and yearned for, Nephi ends up erecting spiritual as well as geographic boundaries to protect himself and his followers from further abuse. Given the family's exposure to repeated acts of violence over the course of their long journey to the Americas, perhaps Jacob's later description of Nephi as a beloved protector on whom his people depended for safety, had very personal depth of meaning, at least for those in the generation of the Nephites who knew Laman and Lemuel personally and who repeatedly suffered under their violent reactions. As we have seen from this review of the family's conflicts, the Book of Mormon begins with raw drama, a family dealing with deep differences, one of which is about how best to resolve family conflict. We can see from the data that family arguments follow a predictable pattern. Every dispute starts with a disagreement over a course of action, followed by an exchange of caustic words, and then Laman and Lemuel escalate matters by resorting to physical violence or attempts at it, sometimes with the help from the sons of Ishmael. In 5 of the contentious incidents, the death of one or more family members is an intended outcome, while in the remaining 3, the death of one or more family members is a possible outcome. Thus, we can say with certainty that these are serious, life-threatening arguments that go beyond typical family disagreement or emotional upset. There is enough intimidation, humiliation, isolation, threat, and bodily harm that we should not shy away from identifying these moments as domestic abuse, nor should we avoid recognizing that Laman and Lemuel are extremely vicious and violent. However, as far as I've been able to discover, the family's fights have never been described as domestic violence in published scholarship, nor have Laman and Lemuel been acknowledged as domestic abusers. Therefore, a brief look at how these men have been portrayed in Book of Mormon scholarship, as well as why there may be hesitation to identify them as abusive, is warranted. Unsurprisingly, Laman and Lemuel are often distinguished by readers and writers for their relentless murmuring and rebellious conduct. In 1st and 2nd Nephi, the words murmur and complain describe Laman and Lemuel more than 20 times. Because of this, Elder Jeffrey R. Holland of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles once joked that many of the physical hardships and privations Nephi experienced during the 8-year journey across the Arabian desert must have been more tolerable to him than listening to Laman and Lemuel's constant murmuring. Elder Neal A. Maxwell, also of the Quorum of the 12, described the brothers as a depressing duo because of their continually negative perspective, commentary, and behavior. As we have already seen, these brothers do, however, display additional characteristics that extend far beyond mere murmuring or complaining. Nearly 40 years ago, one author frankly concluded that Laman and Lemuel emerged from the Book of Mormon as fundamentally corrupt men. 35 years ago, another writer astutely hypothesized that Laman was still single when the family left Jerusalem because his disordered behavior made him an undesirable spouse, and suggested that Lemuel may have had similar problematic personality traits. 25 years ago, Elder Maxwell admitted that the 2 men were often cruel in their responses to parents and siblings. 14 years ago, another writer admitted that Laman and Lemuel's rough treatment of their younger brother is difficult to justify. But he then goes on to do just that by concluding that Laman and Lemuel's behavior is understandable because Nephi had a speaking style that was less than diplomatic. 4 years ago, 2 authors refreshingly filled their commentary on 1st and 2nd Nephi with numerous admissions that Laman and Lemuel behave violently and abusively towards family members, but they also excuse some of the behavior by stating that it was impulsive and done under extreme stress. 2 years ago, one scholar declared that Laman and Lemuel exhibit horrendous behavior on multiple occasions, but he too diminishes the initial condemnation by claiming that the brothers come across not as villains, but as emotional children, throwing infantile and violent tantrums of jealousy. Most recently, another writer argued that Laman and Lemuel's callous infidelity and violent incivility was traumatic, and that it created lasting anxiety and fear in other immediate family members. But he does not identify Laman and Lemuel as perpetrators of domestic abuse. As we have seen, verbal and physical abuse was a constant in Lehi's family over the course of many years. So why would any author hesitate to identify it as domestic violence or be reluctant to recognize Laman and Lemuel as domestic abusers? There may be a historical and a legitimate reason for the hesitation. Since Lehi's family belongs to an ancient culture with its own perspectives, understanding, values, and beliefs that significantly differ from those of the modern day. Scholars know that presentism, or the interpreting of past events in terms of modern values, expectations, or standards, should be carefully avoided when approaching historical figures, and that it is vital for students of the scriptures to understand the differences or potential differences between the context and culture of the original writers of scripture and that of the contemporary reader. The question we need to ask is if the people in Lehi's day would have recognized the family's contention and Laman and Lemuel's role in it as wrong or harmful. As I will show below, this is not an easy question to answer. Extant ancient Middle Eastern legal records contain laws that prohibited assault and battery and required those who caused physical injury to pay fines according to the nature and severity of the damage. Many of these laws also punished men who raped women or fined those who caused a woman to miscarry when she was pregnant, and some even punished women who committed assault and battery against men. Unfortunately, there are no specific references in ancient Israelite legal materials to domestic violence, except in cases of illicit sexuality. So it is difficult to determine if anyone was ever formally punished for assault and battery perpetrated on a family member in the domestic sphere, or how ancient Israelite society felt about such incidents. Research shows that domestic violence existed in ancient Middle Eastern families and was fairly common in the cultures of Lehi's day, including in Israelite society. One author explains that husbands and wives had loving, caring, and compassionate relationships, and that mothers were exhorted not to scold or beat their children, and children were to speak respectfully and truthfully to their parents. But she also admits that though ancient Near Eastern husbands kissed their wives, they also beat them. One study of ancient Israelite families concluded that there was no consensus prohibiting domestic violence in the rabbinic halakhic literature. Some rabbis condemned abusive treatment of women as wrong, while others condoned it as necessary and even acceptable. Furthermore, most systematic studies on the family in ancient Israel are focused on the vertical relations between father or mother and their children, and neglect the horizontal relations between siblings, making it difficult to determine how violence between brothers, which is a principal problem in Lehi's family, was perceived anciently. Additional complications arise because the studies that focus on male violence against women anciently largely fail to consider the sometimes brutal violence exacted against men by other men. In fact, one researcher concluded that power relations in the ancient Near East left not only women, but many, if not most, men dominated by other men. Contributing to this already murky and incomplete picture are ancient Middle Eastern texts that represent harmony between family members as normative and violence in the family circle as exceptional and as a symptom of social degeneration. The Old Testament, for example, teaches that brothers should live together in harmony, should be loyal and honest to each other, should show sympathy with a brother's sorrow, and should care for a brother in need. It also contains stories that illustrate great love and support in family relationships, such as those between Naomi and Ruth, or Mordecai and Esther. However, the Old Testament also presents plenty of fraught family relationships, particularly those between male siblings, as full of rivalry, contention, and violence. Considering the abundant historical ambiguity surrounding the perception of domestic violence anciently, perhaps the Book of Mormon itself can provide the most clarity about how Lehi and Ishmael's families viewed Laman and Lemuel's violent behavior. Though Nephi, the primary receiver of Laman and Lemuel's aggression, does not label what his two older brothers do to him as domestic violence, he clearly doesn't regard their behavior as acceptable. Not only does he consistently and boldly censure his older brothers for their rebellion, murmuring, anger, hard-heartedness, iniquities, and wickedness, on one occasion he invites them to repent of the violence they inflict upon him as the brothers return from Jerusalem with Ishmael's family. It seems, therefore, that Nephi was not a fan of the violence and that he bravely condemned it as wrong. But how did other family members feel? Lehi's opinion as the father of the two offenders seems particularly important, even though Nephi is the primary author of the family's experiences. His writings give us both indirect and direct evidence that Lehi was disapproving of his oldest son's violent tendencies. One subtle indication of Lehi's censure can be seen after the four brothers returned from Jerusalem, first with the plates of brass and later with Ishmael's family. As noted above, both journeys, though successful, involve significant murmuring, doubt, anger, hard words, and physical abuse between the sons. After each return, Lehi offers sacrifice and burnt offerings unto the Lord. Under the law of Moses, which Lehi and his family practiced, animal sacrifices fell into two primary categories: one, free will offerings, and two, reparation offerings. The burnt offerings that Lehi gave could refer to reparation offerings, where a whole animal or specified parts of an animal were offered on a flaming altar to purify, to cleanse, to cover, or to reconcile individuals with God and to obtain forgiveness for intentional or unintentional sin. One scholar observed that Lehi brought to the altar sacrifices that would atone for sin that would stain the camp and those within it. Without freeing his extended family from the taint of unworthiness, they would not be able to carry out the Lord's purposes. It seems likely, therefore, that Lehi perceived the violent events that took place on both return journeys from Jerusalem as unacceptable to God and as a significant reason, if not the primary reason, for performing the atoning animal sacrifices. More direct evidence of Lehi's disapproval of his son's ferocity comes after the family reaches the promised land. Nephi records a conversation between Lehi, Laman, and Lemuel, in which Lehi addresses their violence. He acknowledges that Laman and Lemuel have not always appreciated Nephi's way of speaking to them. The older brothers claim that Nephi has been inappropriately plain, sharp, angry, and unrestrained at times, but Lehi confidently disagrees, describing Nephi's sharpness as the sharpness of the power of the word of God, his anger as the truth, according to that which is in God, and his unrestraint as the Spirit of the Lord which was in him, which opened his mouth to utterance that he could not shut it. While validating Nephi, Lehi openly censures Laman and Lemuel for inflicting much sorrow upon Nephi and for seeking to take away his life. He also openly expresses his very great fear that Nephi will suffer again in similar ways in the future. It seems, therefore, that Lehi perceived Laman and Lemuel's conflict resolution skills as inappropriate and harmful, but not Nephi's, even though Nephi, in a self-reflective moment, admits that he has sometimes yielded to the sinful impulses of the flesh, given way to the temptations of the evil one, and been filled with anger. Though there is no indication that Nephi ever resorted to physical violence against family members in the way his older brothers did, perhaps Lehi's failure to acknowledge or to correct Nephi's occasionally imperfect moments or impure motives was a continuing and significant grievance for the older brothers. However, modern research shows that abusive individuals often overlook or minimize their own angry outbursts and physical attacks, while vociferously and hypocritically condemning anyone who might express anger or frustration, no matter how mild or controlled the other person is. Thus, this important conversation with Lehi may reveal a Laman and Lemuel who, like many abusive individuals, believe that the privilege of rage is reserved for them alone, and that Lehi was well aware of the problem and tried to correct it. Similarly, during a later New World conversation with Jacob, his firstborn in the days of his tribulation in the wilderness, Lehi acknowledges that Jacob has had a difficult childhood. in part because of the rudeness of his brethren. Given Lehi's subsequent admonition, perhaps even prophecy, that Jacob would dwell safely with his brother Nephi, it seems that Laman and Lemuel were the perpetrators of the rudeness and not Nephi or Sam. As we have already seen, rudeness can mean coarseness of manners, incivility, rusticity, and vulgarity, and carries connotations of violence and impetuosity, which suggests that Jacob may also have been on the receiving end of the same type of verbal and physical abuse that Nephi experienced. As Lehi talks to Jacob, he openly acknowledges that Laman and Lemuel's behavior was harmful, that Jacob needed divine healing from it, and that his youthful son needed Nephi's continuing protection. None of this makes sense unless Lehi disapproved of Laman and Lemuel's behavior in the same way that Nephi did. But Nephi and Lehi are only two in a large group of people. How did other family members feel about Laman and Lemuel's hurtful behavior? Even though the Book of Mormon gives only brief glimpses into the thoughts and feelings of other family members, there is enough information to suggest that Lehi and Nephi weren't the only ones who censured Laman and Lemuel's viciousness. As we've already seen, after Nephi escaped Laman and Lemuel's binding cords on the second return trip from Jerusalem, Ishmael's wife, one of her sons, and one of her daughters intervened in Nephi's behalf and pleaded for him in such a way that Laman and Lemuel stopped striving to take away Nephi's life. What the three mediators said is not recorded, but it is unlikely that Laman and Lemuel's hearts would have been softened without de-escalating assertions that violence was not the answer, that it would only end in sorrow and regret, and that there were better ways of resolving brotherly conflict. Similarly, during the terrifying storm on board the ship, the sons of Ishmael spoke up for Nephi, as did Nephi's wife and children. What they said is not recorded either, but the life-threatening circumstances suggest that no one in the family was happy about or supportive of Laman and Lemuel's brutal behavior. Based on this overview of the family's reactions to Laman and Lemuel, it seems that their brutality and violence was not perceived as normal or acceptable by this group, even if domestic violence may have been more acceptable to some in the culture they left behind in Jerusalem. A second reason that modern authors may hesitate to identify Laman and Lemuel's behavior as abuse may be the fact that Laman and Lemuel don't always behave in abusive ways. Many scholars have rightly noted that Laman and Lemuel have their good moments. They humble themselves and submit to the Lord 6 different times on the journey to the promised land, and they usually do exactly what Lehi and Nephi have requested of them, despite having and communicating a consistently bad attitude. As noted above, the two men even feel enough remorse after one violent incident to bow before Nephi and before the Lord to plead for their forgiveness. But these good moments do not earn Laman and Lemuel credit to spend on occasional violence, nor are their good moments a sufficient reason to avoid identifying their bad moments as domestic abuse. Modern research indicates that most abusive men simply don't seem like abusers because, like Laman and Lemuel, they demonstrate many good qualities, including kindness, warmth, dedication, diligence, intelligence, and even humor. Friends often think very highly of those who turn out to abuse family members and are often completely shocked to learn of abusive behavior. It seems, therefore, that no matter what Laman and Lemuel's good qualities are, we shouldn't allow those to distract us from acknowledging that they regularly intimidate, humiliate, isolate, frighten, terrorize, coerce, threaten, blame, hurt, injure, and wound other family members, all of which are forms of domestic violence. The question that naturally follows this frank acknowledgement that Laman and Lemuel were abusive is, where did the two men acquire their propensity for abusive language and violent, life-threatening behavior towards family members? Modern research shows that abuse springs from early cultural training, key role models, peer influences, and acute sensitivity to feelings of shame, and that it is largely a problem of values, attitudes, beliefs, and lack of healthy communication skills. An examination of ancient Israelite family structures in general, and Lehi's behaviors with his family in particular, will show that Laman and Lemuel probably didn't learn their violent behaviors from Lehi, but they may have learned them from their culture, other key role models, and other peer influences. In First Temple Israel, the time period inclusive of Lehi's day, the family was the primary context in which the individual's location, functions, and roles in society were understood and transacted. Like most ancient Near Eastern cultures, Israelite families were patrilineal, which means the official lines of descent were traced through the father's line, patrilocal, meaning married women joined the households of their husbands, and patricentric, the father governed the household. In other words, family life radiated outward from the father. However, guided by biblical teachings, Israelite fathers were encouraged to perceive family members as extensions of their own lives. Because a father's interests were heavily dependent upon the well-being of the members of his household, it was, theoretically, in his best interest to create confidence, trust, and security in his relationships with family members, rather than holding the privilege of power over them in a despotic or tyrannical way. However, as is true in any society, the reality of human experience doesn't always match with professed ideals, opening the door for variety in patricentric leadership philosophies and styles in ancient Israelite culture. Thanks to Nephi's recordings, we can get a fairly good idea of the type of father Lehi was. From the beginning, Nephi describes Lehi and Sariah as goodly parents. He shows readers that Lehi had a deep personal commitment to Jehovah, that he was a diligent teacher, instructing his family in the laws of God, salvation, and covenants, and that he encouraged his family to develop spiritually. Though we don't know what Lehi did to earn a living, he seems to have been a successful provider. We can also see that whenever Lehi interacts with concerned or frustrated family members, he does so appropriately. For example, Lehi uses correcting metaphorical comparisons with Laman and Lemuel. He listens to, validates, shares testimony with, and comforts a worried Sariah. He feelingly and tenderly exhorts Laman and Lemuel to greater obedience, and calmly but directly speaks to them about their hurtful behavior. He encourages and fortifies an anxious young Jacob, who patiently helps an even younger Joseph understand his place in God's plan, and he takes the time to instruct, remind, inspire, and bless all of his posterity before he dies. Like any mortal parent, Lehi wasn't perfect. He may have unduly favored Nephi in certain ways, or occasionally lost the larger perspective during times of adversity. But in all his recorded interactions with family, there seems to be no indication that he got angry, that he used belittling language, or that he physically harmed anyone. Scholars who have scrutinized Lehi's parenting style also describe him positively as an experienced, respected, influential, faithful, loving, righteous, kind, nurturing, concerned, invested, and hopeful father. It seems very unlikely, therefore, that Laman and Lemuel witnessed or learned domestically abusive behaviors from him. So we must look further afield for an explanation. Some authors have argued that Laman and Lemuel's religious and ideological beliefs align closely with those of the Jerusalem elite. So it is possible that in associating with the wealthy upper class, Laman and Lemuel witnessed, learned, or even acquired a belief that a privileged, dominating form of leadership in the family was more desirable and effective than what they saw Lehi doing at home. Research shows that Israelites and many other groups in the ancient world utilized different forms of violence, including domestic violence, to establish and remove a person's societal value and to highlight superior status and claims to power. For some Israelite men, dominance was seen as being so totalizing that it was used to erase the worth of anyone perceived to be a transgressive inferior, even in the central relationships between husbands and wives, between fathers and children, and between siblings. As we will see in more detail shortly, whenever someone in the family, usually Lehi or Nephi, transgresses one of Laman or Lemuel's religious tenets or cultural expectations, The brothers quickly and repetitively resort to physical violence. Perhaps Laman and Lemuel believed that masculine leadership in its most visible and lauded form was domineering, raging, and fearsome, and that it was appropriate for a leader to establish or reestablish order by aggressively compelling subordinates to get back into line. This next chart details 4 types of transgressions that Laman and Lemuel seem to be highly sensitive to and that trigger their violent behavior. First, a younger son presuming to lead or instruct the elder sons. This is in 6 of the 8 arguments. Second, someone claiming to receive revelation or other instructions from Jehovah. This is in 4 of the 8 conflicts. Third, someone interfering with the receipt and or enjoyment of inherited property. This appears in 3 of the 8 arguments. And fourth, anyone suggesting that Jerusalem will be destroyed or that its people are wicked and need to repent. This is in 4 of the 8 conflicts. Even though triggers 2 and 4 could be an indication of Laman and Lemuel's religious beliefs and their perceptions of Lehi and Nephi as false prophets, the brothers did not have a legal right under the law of Moses to take either of their lives without a public trial before community leaders and witnesses. Laman and Lemuel's religious beliefs, therefore, were probably a rationalization for their violent behavior, not a legitimate justification. But religious rationalization alone does not explain why they react so violently to a younger son leading or to the loss of their expected inheritance. However, if we examine the 4 triggers together, we can see that the 2 men have strong desires to be in control of others and to have the last word in decision-making. They have inflated feelings of entitlement about both their right to be in charge and their right to a life of ease and luxury. And they have a hard time accepting correction, whether the correction is directed at themselves or at those with whom they have an affinity, such as the elite Jews in Jerusalem. In other words, Laman and Lemuel seem to struggle with the 3 characteristics that modern research has found to be at the core of those who engage in domestic abuse, no matter what culture they come from. These are 1, a compulsive need to control others, 2, feelings of entitlement, and 3, self-righteousness. Even though Laman and Lemuel acknowledge and seem to genuinely repent of their abusiveness on 2 occasions, and also humble themselves on 3 other occasions, the changes they make don't last. Their cyclical behavior may reflect the same pattern that modern researchers have detected in those who are chronically abusive towards family members. An abuser's sorrow over abusive behavior, even when the regret is genuine, often collides with stronger feelings of entitlement, control, and victim blaming, causing the abuser's remorse to fade quickly and the abusive behaviors to resume. Thus, the Lord warned Nephi and his followers to separate from Laman and Lemuel to avoid the immediate threat to Nephi's life. But he may also have commanded Nephi's group to establish their own colony, because by this time he knew that the cyclical pattern of abuse was likely going to continue. As modern research has shown, Nephi's life was never in more danger than when he tried to leave the abusive situation, thus his need to quickly make many swords for protection. So to conclude, if the United States national statistics are right, there will be over 1 million acts of interpersonal or domestic violence by the end of each month this year. As I have shown, the Book of Mormon speaks powerfully to this troubling plague that affects too many people around the world. Though I have only begun to scratch the surface of what the Book of Mormon can offer us in relation to domestic violence, I have shown that 1st and 2nd Nephi unabashedly displayed multiple instances of domestic violence taking place in Lehi's immediate family, that the 8 recorded conflicts are more than normal family arguments, that Laman and Lemuel consistently demonstrate issues with control, entitlement, and self-righteousness, and that they probably didn't learn their vicious behaviors from their father. It seems that the whole family suffered, either directly or indirectly, from Laman and Lemuel's harmful behavior, and that Nephi's departure was a wisely necessary act to get many of them away from continued abuse. Because interpersonal violence is such a widespread phenomenon, many readers who approach the Book of Mormon may be victims of this type of abuse, and some may even be perpetrators. Thus, it is important that we identify what Laman and Lemuel are doing as domestic abuse, that we accept that the two brothers are perpetrators of abuse, and that we begin utilizing the Book of Mormon as a source that can help us understand, deal with, heal from, and help eradicate this terribly pervasive problem. So thank you. I am done now.
Thank you, Jan. This is a marvelous presentation to
So
highlight.
I'm happy to open it up to questions. I'll stop sharing my screen unless you want the screen shared, and you guys can take over.
I thank you, Jan, for I see this as a remarkable demonstration of the dysfunctionality, an example of it in the Book of Mormon, but one which applies so widely across our societies. I'm particularly intrigued that your references to the patriarchal, patrilineal system shows that that may very well be a key factor. And as I reflect upon it, if you look at the matriarchal societies, it would appear that they may very well be much less inclined toward domestic violence. Think of the Iroquois, where the women would elect the men to be in the council, but they would take an oath the men would take an oath to consider the welfare of the women and the children, and even the children yet unborn, as an oath before they could be considered wise enough to be on that council. That I'm curious if you have any information that would help us with that contrast.
Yeah, like I've mostly just researched the stuff in the Middle East. And so I haven't looked at comparable things at a similar time period in the Americas, which would obviously be a next thing to do, because we have these ancient cultures, we have influence from probably other ancient cultures on the Lehites when they moved in to the Americas. So it would be interesting to see the different types of society and the way that they are led in other places. But in the ancient Middle East, it's not matriarchal largely. So the patrilineal stuff is well all I've looked at the moment, just because I've been focusing on where the Lehites came from and what they brought with them, and not so much on what happened once they got here. But there's probably some influence there as well. So,
I find it very intriguing, and particularly because we hear the prophecies from some of the matriarchal societies that we're moving from an age of empire to an age in which women will lead in peace.
Yeah.
We might need to learn some things from the matriarchal.
Yeah, there's lots to do with it on the Americas, and I just haven't even gotten there. I've just been so absorbed by trying to figure out the murkiness of what's going on with domestic abuse in the Middle East and how people would have perceived it, and it's pretty messy. So yeah.
Again, let me thank you for your excellent presentation, and let's encourage people, if you'll raise your hands or go to the react button at the bottom, raise your hand.
I see Blair Bryant has a hand up. So Blair, let's start with you, and then Thomas Murphy, I think, has a hand up as well. So
Deb commonly maintains the queue because
okay, I'll let you
raise their hands.
You tell me then. You just pick someone. Okay.
But yes.
Okay, Thomas, go ahead, please.
Okay, I had to unmute there. Thank you. Well, I just want to say initially, thank you for addressing this topic. I think it's a very important topic, domestic violence in particular. I am one of those survivors of domestic violence, and so I really think it's very important that for the attention that you're bringing to these issues. In my family's experience, though, it wasn't Laban and Lemuel that were used to justify the violence. It was Nephi's behavior that was used to justify the violence that I experienced.
So were they focusing on like taking Laban's life? Like where would are they looking at that, or would they?
Yes, particularly the killing of Laban,
Okay.
in the sense that it's better that one man should suffer, or that one man should suffer than
And the whole nation should
than the whole nation should perish. And so in my personal experience, it was actually Nephi, and so I'm just curious how you would address Nephi's behavior in relationship to the models that you've been discussing.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges with this is this concept of self-righteousness that a lot of abusers have. It'd be very easy for them to identify with Nephi because that's what they want to do. And because we tend to be negative about Laban and Lemuel, and the self-righteousness is a real thing amongst abusers, it'd be interesting. It's not interesting to me, like it's not surprising to me that they wouldn't want to identify with Laban and Lemuel because they're not going to want to be seen as lacking in righteousness. Like they justify the abuse by telling you that they're doing it for your benefit or something. And so this is an interesting thing to have to navigate of how could we use the Book of Mormon to help abusers and not give them that kind of thing, because that doesn't surprise me at all. But what we want to do is not shy away from arguing that there's domestic abuse in Lehi's family for sure. And so I recognize this is going to be interesting, but I think it's worth trying to do it because so many people are suffering from abuse, and the Book of Mormon, I believe, could be a really healing instrument if you were willing to talk about it like that. But I can totally see why a self-righteous abuser would identify with me. Like that's what you do. But thank you. It's as I put all this together, it's something I'm gonna have to figure out a way to address that. Yeah.
Thanks, Thomas. Blair, go ahead, and then we'll have Earl.
All right. I want to thank you for such a great presentation about putting it into today's terminology. But you mentioned that you had done studies of the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done the study of the dysfunctionality of the family of Isaac?
Yeah, there's lots of people that are looking at that and use it as one of the Bible's examples of a problem brotherly relationship. Yeah, so there's lots of scholars looking at that and trying to make sense of what Rebecca was doing, and then what's going on with Jacob and Esau. But the nice thing between those two is they seem to reconcile in the end, at least to some degree, when Jacob returns. But yes, that is one of the stories that's highly discussed for dysfunction. Yeah.
Well, I think that the resolution came about with Jacob.
Yeah.
Where he wrestled all night before his encounter with Esau.
Yeah.
It was coming up the next day, and he had to wrestle with God.
Yeah, he got to get right. Like, he's really got some work to do. Yeah.
And because of that, it changed his life.
Yeah.
It changed Jacob's life, and God renamed him.
Well, and you can see why, to let God prevail in that instance rather than a grudge or his old way of dealing with his brother. Like that's a huge change for him. So I think the name is fitting because it seems that was part of that all night wrestle, is trying to get over that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Just wanted to see if you were keyed into that particular.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like There's a lot of research looking at Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, just that whole group, because there's plenty of brotherly dysfunction going on there.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Blair. Earl and then Kylie. Go ahead, please. Earl, remember to unmute.
I appreciated your lecture. I think you're a very good lecturer,
Thank you.
but it opened my eyes in looking at violence
Mm,
because you really, for me, you really spread it out and did a much better job of defining it than I have seen in the past.
thank you.
I have never experienced much family violence, so I can't relate to a lot of that, although I do have a rather hot temper. So, anyway, I just wanted to say thank you very much and glad that you presented.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Earl. Kylie, go ahead, please, and then Val.
Hi, Kylie.
Hi, Jan. How are you?
Here.
That's great. I know I love this presentation, and I'm loving the bigger version of it that
Yeah.
I haven't heard yet. I'm wondering about kind of the women's thing again, because they don't seem to turn on Sariah or the daughters, and in fact, then throughout the rest of the Book of Mormon, Lamanites are kind of known for taking care of women. I'm just wondering how does that play into this? Because usually you think abusers would go for the
Well,
women
and
first.
like you're saying, this is one of the most intriguing things about this portrayal is the seeming lack, other than on the ship, where the wives and everyone are being caught up in this. It's not just between brothers going on here, except on the ship. It seems largely that the women are just observers and not targets. And like you said, there is a way of reading the Book of Mormon that the Lamanites are nicer to women. I'm not sure that's always as clear as some people want it to be. But with Laman the way that he is and his violence towards at least his male siblings, that is very clear. And it continues all the way through Lamanite society that they want to annihilate Nephites. And so you can see that animosity, and then it grows into a societal desire to annihilate the Nephite group. But that's another thing I need to have a look at more carefully, which I haven't had time to do, is investigate a little bit more about what is going on with that. Because typically when we talk about domestic violence today, it's men against women. And it appears to be, at least in Nephi's view, about brothers, which is really weird. I mean, you do have domestic violence in families that targets everybody, but typically, as you say, it's men against women that take the brunt of it. And Sariah just doesn't seem to be, but her husband isn't violent. So how Laman and Lemuel treat their mother is not clear in the text. You see Nephi portraying Sariah very kindly and very nicely, but you just don't really see Laman and Lemuel until you get on the ship and they completely ignore their parents. So there's something there, Kylie, and I don't know what to do with it, but I'm gonna have to look at that next. Yeah. I don't know if that's helpful to you, but I see where you're coming from. It's really odd that we don't have women, at least in Nephi's narrative, being the target.
Yeah, and just to throw in there though, I wonder about Jacob. As you pointed out, and I've noticed those things before too, he seems to have gotten the brunt of it.
He does.
And I've wondered about if it's because Lehi continually calls him my firstborn in the wilderness.
Yep.
So he's usurping kind of Laman's place. That poor little kid.
Yeah, and that would be, as I've showed you, they're very entitled, Laman and Lemuel, to their leadership role, and to interpret Lehi as replacing them with Jacob may be a thing. And they feel very threatened by him, even though he's a little kid and there's nothing he could do. But that tells you something about what is this? At least between the men in the family, there's some serious issues. But looking more at the women, I need to do that and just see if I can see anything else, but I haven't focused on them yet. But thank you for pointing that out. It's a thing I've seen too. And you know, when you look at how the men end up treating the women once Nephi dies, and you have that concubine system and you have all that stuff, there's a whole nother thing going on there too. So yeah. Thank you. Yes, we need to look at it.
Val, and then Keith. Go ahead, please, Val.
All right. So I think that taking the name of the Lord in vain is most manifest when somebody does violence against innocent people for religious reasons.
Yeah.
That's a lot worse than saying God or cussing,
Right.
that kind of violence. And but there's a kind of I think in the scriptures there's a kind of tension that like one plausible inspiration for Laman and Lemuel, I think it's a highly plausible one, is Josiah's violence in cleansing Israel. So he was going and
He was.
he was killing all over the place, and this would have been when Laman and Lemuel were coming of age. So
Right.
so their hero, if they were part of the Deuteronomous faction,
Yeah. Right.
would have been a violent man going out and killing people in God's name. And I mentioned this to you at the BOM, and you're well acquainted with it, is Deuteronomy 13, which tells people in that movement, kill anybody who's a visionary man that's saying something contrary to what this new movement was saying, and specifically kill a brother who is not true to their conception of Moses's law. So, but that's in our Bible too. Josiah is celebrated as a hero. Samuel condemns Saul when he doesn't wipe out everybody, and so within the scriptures you've got this thing of a religious purity and violence in the name of God at times being celebrated. And even Christ says, "I come not to bring I'm bringing a sword." Now, that was a specific. I think that's a limited kind of thing, but he says, "I'm going to be dividing families and so forth." So there is running through the scriptures this theme of purity, which, in a sense, I think we've captured as moderns the truth when we stopped having religious wars. But but it's partly because we stopped caring about religion as much as they did. To them, it mattered intensely to have correct beliefs and correct engagement with God.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if you could tease out a little bit, how do we engage the scriptures that have this emphasis on purity? Probably Laman and Lemuel being inspired, at least in part, by Josiah, a biblical hero, and yet the Book of Mormon is showing the cost of that, and I don't know. I mean, that's the set of things that.
No, I appreciate that. It's an interesting thing to try to unravel, and as I did in this lengthier version, going back and looking at what's going on in the Middle East, it's a mess. And trying to, you have these different ideas of violence, and it's okay and it's not, and and all of that, and that's just a piece of what you're talking about. When is it appropriate and when isn't it? And then you've got Lehi and Laban right at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, which is a violent act, but God seems to be supporting that act. And so thank you. Yeah, it's a thing I'm just going to have to keep working on figuring that out, because Laman and Lemuel rightly may have a Josiah-based justification for what they're doing and feel that righteous indignation for what they're approaching with their religious beliefs. But the trouble is also with the how far can you take that when the community expects you to handle it justly in the community and not just take your own, you can't just go and do things on your own, which is interesting when you're in the wilderness. So yeah, so I will keep looking at that. Thank you. It's an interesting thing to try and thread.
Okay. Thank you, Val. Keith, and then Paul. Go ahead, Keith. Please remember to unmute.
Yeah, it's unmuted. Thank you. I have a theory first and then a question.
Okay.
My theory is, and you might want to check it out a little more in detail, but you mentioned that Laman and Lemuel didn't direct their animosity towards the women so much as their brothers. And in most of the scriptures that I've read, particularly in the Old Testament, the brothers are all vying for leadership positions in their family because they're told from birth that the oldest inherits the father's wealth and the others are left to the mercy of the older brother. So there's a lot of animosity between the brothers, particularly if they're a little closer in age. In the scriptures, there are a few instances of the women who are leaders and even prophets, but not that many.
Right.
And for the most part, the women seem to be subservient, especially to their fathers and their husbands.
Right.
And this may be why they're not targeted so much by the older brothers. In modern times, we see that women are recognized more as an equal to their men, their husbands, not so much the fathers, but their husbands, their boyfriends, whatever. And so this equality tends to make them a little more willing to argue, to accuse, or whatever they feel is appropriate. So anyway.
Yeah, so you're saying they don't maybe feel as threatened by women as maybe modern people do, basically. Because we don't have such a subservient culture that they did then. Yeah. So there may be something to that, yeah.
Yeah. So my question then, what training do modern priesthood members, both in the Community of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what training is provided or required to deal with domestic abuse? And I'll preface that, well, not preface because it's after, but a few years ago, we had a conference, World Church Conference for Community Christ. And it was brought up that many of our ministers will not deal with domestic abuse from members within their congregation. And I pointed out from the floor that there was a person that I knew that had called the priesthood to act on her behalf because her husband was abusing her.
Mm-hmm.
And that priesthood member said, "No, I'm not getting involved." There was no help whatsoever from the priesthood because they didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to get between the two.
Yeah.
So what can we do as priesthood to help settle those kinds of disputes?
Well, I think you're talking about two different types of people. Obviously, there's priesthood holders who are in leadership positions, like a bishop, for example, who will be confronted with those kind of things. And obviously, I've never been a bishop and I can only read the handbook. So I don't know what specific training our bishops are receiving to handle domestic abuse, but in my experience, I would say it's probably not very extensive, even though they're given hotlines and things to call. I would say that I don't know because I'm not a bishop and haven't been to one, so I don't know what kind of training they get. But I would just say from my anecdotal experience, it's not great. I think they're given numbers to call and people to consult with, but I don't think they're actually going to any kind of, you know, help that's done by professionals on how to try and respond to those situations and not take sides, but also not brush people off. Like, that's what happens, is they either don't believe someone or they maybe take a side and not hear the other side. Like, there's always sides. So I think we could, as church organizations, for bishops and stake presidents that we have, maybe do some better training. Now, as far as just regular priesthood holders, they don't get any training. You know, and I don't know that we even talk about it very much, other than don't do it.
Well, I know in community,
Yeah.
I know in Community of Christ, there is some training required before ordination, but
I don't think there is in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
there is nothing required in the way of dealing with domestic abuse.
Yeah.
When we passed that resolution in that conference several years ago, the church did come up with a course, but it has not been emphasized nor required.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know what the status of it is today, because they didn't bother to consult me.
Well, yeah. And they're obviously not consulting me, so I don't know, but I do believe that we could, as an organization, on general level as well as leadership level, do a lot better than we do, because I just don't think people are trained particularly well. But I don't know about your church, but I can only speak from mine. I don't see a lot of formal anything going on. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Jan. It's a very good presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, Paul, and then Boyd.
Let me address this last issue. There is a certain amount of address of that matter for youth workers. The certification for people working with youth does provide a certain amount of background in that respect. I'd like to go back to the point, though, that you raised, the privilege of rage. I thought that was an interesting phrase, and it struck me as being one that has been rather profoundly addressed to us by two of our previous speakers.
Okay.
One of them was Kylie.
Oh, great.
Who pointed out that we act as if. I think her whole presentation was basically about that two words, the two letters of if, but we act as if. And here's the excuse. When we can provide excuses for ourselves, we don't have to do what's right.
Right.
And the other one was Christopher Thomas, who emphasized the power of murmuring. And you hit that again tonight, but with your 17. But the idea of the murmuring being the stimulus by which to encourage the longer term violence, the frustration, the revolution, the action that justifies mistreating other people.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued that we have these subtle little eggs that are sort of rotten that they hatch anyway.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting thinking about, the clear problems between Laman and Lemuel and Nephi, and the way they're interpreting each other's behavior, and the fingers that are being kind of pointed around. But this concept of privilege of rage, none of us actually have a privilege of rage, and we use it to justify our other behavior, for sure.
Well, but then you notice that you just mentioned taking sides, and the Book of Mormon is very clear about whose side we should take.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully we're taking the Savior's side. And that's one thing I love about the Book of Mormon. It does portray Nephi as having those moments of recognition that he's not been perfect, and he has a problem with anger as well, and he admits that. But he's hopefully handling it a little differently than maybe Laman and Lemuel, who don't seem to want to recognize maybe that they need to fix that. So, but we don't have their perspective either, and so we have to be careful on that. We only have Nephi's view, but yeah, it's an interesting thing, but I've spent a lot of time in our Doctrine and Covenants, section 121, looking at appropriate use of priesthood power, and it just nails any of that rage. Like, we use it with persuasion, long suffering, gentleness, meekness, love unfeigned, and we're not supposed to be trying to coerce anyone for any reason. You just persuade, and yeah, it's a problem. Thank you.
Again, thank you.
Okay, Boyd, and then David. Go ahead, Boyd. Please unmute.
Oh, Jen, that was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
We had some good comments in here too. Some of the people have been commenting on. I wanted to address something that Val brought up there. He brought up something earlier that's really good. But before I do, I want to ask you a question. When it comes to domestic abuse, have you done research at all into satanic ritual abuse?
No, I haven't. I've mostly just looked at just the domestic variety, so I haven't delved into some of the other deeper evil things that are out there. So no, sorry. Domestic abuse is evil enough, so I haven't looked.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Yeah, but
You know,
enlighten me, like what have you got?
well, I don't want to take all night on this one, but yeah, no. When I was in the LDS Church for 27 years, and I was in church leadership,
Okay.
and there was kind of a, if you had I didn't have to deal with anybody personally,
Okay.
With satanic ritual abuse. James E. Faust one time spoke in conference. He mentions, something about the occult, and he talked about, but it's never mentioned in general conference.
Yeah, I do remember. That was a great talk.
Yeah, but then you got the church handbook of instructions that says, well, if you run into somebody that has gone through, satanic ritual abuse or anything, you send them to your stake president, your church authorities.
Yeah.
Of course, they have a hotline too. But then James E. Faust, on the other hand, said he didn't know much about it. So, I mean, what do you do?
Yeah.
And then meanwhile, he had Glenn A. Pace, he was in the 70s, and he put a pretty good report on it, but it's prevalent out there, and yet they don't talk about it.
Yeah, like obviously, I've never been in that kind of leadership position, so I haven't been confronted with those kind of things. And you look in our current handbook and you see what they've got, but I've had no experience with anything like that personally. So yeah, that would be interesting.
The other thing, Val brought up a good point earlier, and he was talking about the possibility that some of this behavior from Laman and Lemuel may have related to the situation with King Josiah.
Yes, and like I said in the paper, they may have learned all of this from that elite group of religious people who had that particular bent, that this was okay, and so there is some legitimacy to that they may have believed. Yeah.
And I think he's right on that. And, just to give you kind of some other things that's going on, at the time when Lehi was living in Jerusalem, you had two opposing religions. What King Josiah was involved with was a religious war against sorcerers, witchcraft, magic. These guys, in fact, in Ezekiel's time, just a few years later, he's saying they were practicing this in the temple. I mean, it was prevalent.
Right.
And so they had Satanism was at its peak then, which is, what caused Jerusalem to fall.
Yeah.
More than anything else, it's the occult that took over. It just what happened to the Nephites, and at the end, they were destroyed because of the occult.
Right.
Now there's something that's kind of interesting here. Laban was very prominent in Jerusalem at the time. He had a garrison of 50 people at his immediate command. He had tens of thousands under his command.
Right.
So he was prominent. There's no way he could have been in that position unless he was an advanced sorcerer.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, I've done some research into Laban, but I've not heard any of the other scholars making that connection about sorcery. They've certainly put him up there in the echelons of being a leader and having lots of power. But I've not heard that before.
And this is a subject I've studied in quite intensely, for many years. Now something about a
Hmm,
little bit more going on in here that meets
interesting.
the eye.
Yeah. Well, I'll have a look.
When
I hadn't looked into that before, but that would be worth looking into.
Yeah, there's something else that meets the eye here that that's been overlooked. When Nephi went to saw Laban plastered on the ground,
Yeah.
he was drunk. Now he said the spirit told him to whack off Laban's head.
Mhm.
I personally do not believe that was the Lord. And I tell you what spirit I believe was there.
Mm.
Laban was an advanced sorcerer. At that moment, Nephi was holding his sword, and this was not a normal sword. This had gold in it. It was it was highly engraved. It was an expensive sword. Now, an advanced sorcerer will oftentimes have a weapon that is used in ceremonies of sorcery.
Mhm.
As such, it would carry demonic spirits with it, much like you would have a voodoo doll or something like that. That would, once you go put that thing through a ceremony, it carries a spirit that influences whoever's the target.
Okay.
And now here, Nephi is holding that sword and admiring it. At that moment is when he was having a dialogue between whatever that spirit was, that demonic spirit. Now remember, now he's got an advanced sorcerer here on the ground that's been through satanic ceremonies. He's demonically possessed.
Okay.
And here's that spirit that is speaking to him and convincing him to whack off Laban's head. Now,
That's
notice the argument here that was being used. Um, Remember, he said that it is better that one man should perish and a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. Do you know who else said that same argument? It was Caiaphas.
okay.
He said this, and one of them named Caiaphas. This is found in John chapter 11, with verse 49. It says, and one of them named Caiaphas, being a high priest that same year, said unto them, ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. The same argument. The
Mm.
same demon that was talking to Caiaphas was talking to
Okay. To Nephi. Okay.
Nephi.
All
Now,
right.
Nephi said a lot of things that are profound. I mean, they came from the Lord. That dream he had was from the Lord. He said he kept, prompting us and teaching us the principles of Christ. He heard the Lord in that, but a person is not always righteous 100% of the time. We're human. It's possible we can be influenced by one spirit or the other at any given time. Sometimes Nephi was inspired by the Lord, and sometimes in a situation like what happened to Laban, I'm certain that was a different spirit. Now, here's another thing, another little insight. There's another time when that sword was mentioned. Nephi kept that sword. Now, he just said that in that same argument, now he resisted that spirit several times, at least twice he resisted and said, I'm not going to do this. I've never killed a man before. And yet the spirit said, kill him anyway. And about the third attempt, he finally gave in and did it. In other words, that spirit was speaking against Nephi's conscience. There was nothing justified about killing Laban. Laban was plastered on the ground. He wasn't going anywhere. And he could have gotten the plates and gotten back before Laban ever would have woke up, more than likely. But the next time that sword is mentioned was in 2nd Nephi. And then once again, Nephi is starting to justify himself. That spirit is speaking to him from that sword.
Mm.
Now, notice that right after that, and there's a lot more involved here, but right after that is when Nephi is saying, well, the people twisted my arm and want me to become a king. And he said, well, I'm going to indulge and do it. I'm going to go ahead and be a king for the people, what they want. But, the brother Jared he argued against being a king too. He wouldn't, he and his sons, they would not volunteer to become kings. They turned it down when they were asked. Alma was it requested to be a king. He turned it down flat. And years later, King Mosiah had the fortitude to have to change this whole thing, this whole mistake that Nephi made about start establishing kings to begin with, and he established his system of judges. But if Nephi was hearing the right spirit, he would never have become king. He would have done the same thing as his brother Jared did, and he would have done the same thing Alma did. But because he was subject to pride, and he was subject to that spirit and that sword, that demonic spirit, he responded to it, and he did exactly again something that he shouldn't have done. That's what my view of. So I'm thinking in this, and I don't know this, but I'm wondering if that Nephi, now those brothers are wicked. There's no question. They did something. They were being influenced by. They kept wanting to go back to Jerusalem. And we know that Jerusalem was on the verge of being captured by the Babylonians, and sorcery was really high there. But for some reason, they couldn't see what was so bad about Jerusalem. They wanted to go back. But then Nephi, on the other hand, he seemed to be subject to some pride there. And once in a while, he seemed like he might have been provoking his brothers. Doesn't justify the violence.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering that he may not be as clean as you think it is, because, the victors write the history, right? And he's the only one that we have the record that was writing this whole thing, So
Yeah,
anyway, that's what I'm seeing it.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. I hadn't made the sorcery connection, so it'll be interesting to have a look at that. So thank you.
Looks like Deb might have stepped away from
Yeah, it sounds like we lost Deb.
David.
This is David DeBarth. I'll go ahead, since it looks like my picture's the next one up. Thank you, Jen.
My hand up, so go for it.
Thank you, Jen, for having the courage to deal with the situation that most of us would rather turn our backs to. It's a very difficult situation in today's world. You're looking at it historically, but that makes us more aware of, hey, it's going on today. I wanted to comment, though, on the training today that is needed. I think you find that in order to get the kind of training to deal with that kind of situation, it takes like 6 years of college, university, 8 years, and you're expecting, and to expect someone to, without any of that training at all, to be of help, I think is kind of a poor expectation. It appears to me that the people who are first aware of abuse in a family are the friends of the children who are being abused, the friends of the women who are being abused, not the officials.
Right. Yeah.
And because of that, what I think we need is more education of how you get a hold of those people who have that training, and maybe some help on how you get people to talk to those people who have that training, so that we can have the professionals help these poor souls out. I think any follower of Christ needs to take some action when you become aware of something like that. But that doesn't mean you've got the training to fix it.
Exactly.
But you do very quickly can get the training to find somebody who can help. And so in educating priesthood, non-priesthood, anyone Christian, I think that education needs to be, where's the help you need when you find a situation like this?
I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, just having people speak up and try and do something is a huge step. So yeah, thank you. Well, I don't see any more hands. I don't see any more questions. So whoever's in charge, are we done now?
Paul usually goes ahead and sings us out before everybody leaves.
Well, I think I agree that that's the appropriate indicator. We are at 9:45, and I do need to be able to make my way to Iowa in the morning. So to get some sleep first would be very useful.
Right.
But let me share just a verse here because it strikes me as being appurtenant to the topic this evening. Weave us together, weave us together in unity and love. Weave us together, weave us together together in love. We are many textures, we are many colors, each one different from the other. But we are entwined with one another in one great tapestry. Weave us together. Weave us together in unity and love. Weave us together. Weave us together in love. Moments ago, we did not know our unity, only diversity. Now the Christ in me greets the Christ in thee in one great family. Weave us together. Weave us together in unity and love. Weave us together. Weave us together in unity and love. Good night.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night.
you both. Night, Brent. Thanks, Jane. It was a wonderful, sorry, Jan, it was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was nice to be here with you guys this evening.
We'll look forward to seeing you the end of June.
I guess I'll be back.
Yeah.
Yes, and thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good night, everybody.
Night.
Robert and Deb, I will be in Cedar Rapids on next Monday, and so I'm not sure what my access to the internet will be. I will be in a hotel, so presumably should be, but I should at least warn you that I will not be at my regular digs here in Kansas.
Okay.
But we should have. The gentleman has not spoken with us before, but I've talked with him a couple of times, and his name is Phil Andrus. He is the one who invited me to Cameron to be the master of ceremonies when Ryan Daly was the speaker there. And so Phil Andrus is the speaker we have scheduled. And because I will not be in my normal digs, then therefore I raise the warning just a week in advance.
Okay, sounds good.
Good night.
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 Night, Ron. Night, Jean.